So I'm fighting this cold, so my voice is a little more hoarse of late. Just so as you know, it's raining, so you're gonna hear that. So I watched this Netflix series over the weekend. I binged it, called Mindhunter, and if you haven't watched it, I recommend it. It's really good. It's basically chronicling the early days of the behavioral sciences division of the FBI, where basically they invented the whole idea of profiling in terms of finding serial killers, diagnosing people who are serial killers, that sort of thing. And it was really, really good, and it was really disturbing. There's a lot of disturbing imagery and just storyline, and it's just it was good. It was quite good. But there was this theme that I picked up on in the series. Keep in mind that this was in the 70s, 60s, 70s. I think it was the 70s. Guy drove a Chevy Nova, so I think that's the 70s, right? Anyway, so these serial killers, this one Ed Kemper, this other guy Brudos, I think was his name, and then there's this other dude that they basically, in using their profiling, actually discovered who he was based on their prior experience with these other serial killers. And they weren't called serial killers at the time. It wasn't until near the end of the series that they actually came up with that phrase. But what they noticed was that a lot of these guys suffered terrible abuse at the hands of their mothers. And it got me thinking about it a little bit. And I'm thinking about, okay, so what was happening at that time? Keep in mind that this was, shortly after the Equal Rights Act was passed. I think that was passed in '64 in the United States. And there was a shift, I guess, in sort of traditional gender roles, and of course, what ultimately led to a lot more divorce, and a lot more broken homes, and a lot more resentful women, because the whole traditional nuclear family with father as breadwinner, mother as caregiver and homemaker, which had worked for centuries, I guess, had been turned on its ear when women started to vote and women started to work. And it increasingly led to a lot of dissatisfaction amongst men and also amongst women, right? So what ended up happening was basically in the storyline, these mothers resented their children and hated their children, this Ed Kemper and this Brudos guy, and mistreated them terribly. And what this ended up happening was it ended up causing a lot of anger towards women in general. And in the case of Ed Kemper, he ended up killing his mother in the story. And yeah, it just kind of, it made me come to the realization, see, I grew up with a great mother who would never, who never mistreated my brother or myself growing up. But I know mothers who did kind of mistreat their kids. And because serial killers aren't just, born bad, they are in part a product of their environment. These things sort of ended up being, I guess, triggers or stressors. They didn't call them triggers. They called them stressors, which makes sense. They would add to the, the anxiety and the feelings of animosity and anger towards their victims. So I guess what I'm trying to say is feminism is responsible for creating serial killers. At least 2 of them, anyway. But if you know anything about serial killers, if you read up on anything about serial killers, typically they're sexually motivated. Typically it's men who go after women. And my guess is that in a lot of cases, part of it is brought on by the fact that the very first relationship a boy has with a woman is with his mother, typically. And they spend their formative years with their mother. So if, for whatever reason, that mother mistreats that child, it's ultimately going to lead to how that kid turns out. It doesn't mean that every kid who gets abused by their mother is going to turn into a serial killer. But in the case of Ed Kemper, you know, he went on to live with his mother as well, right? So he was he had troubles to begin with. He went off to live with his grandparents. I guess he was mistreated there as well. His first murder was of his grandparents, so he went to, because he was a teenager, he went to a psychiatric facility during his teenage years. And so he never had that opportunity in the 1960s, which is when he was in this institution, to sort of sow his oats during the sexual revolution that was going on in the 60s. And so when he got out, he had no way to deal with women. He didn't know how to. It was very awkward and very, you know, asocial or poorly socialized. And add on to that his mother absolutely loathed him and made no bones about telling him that every single day of his life. Now, he'd become a serial killer before he murdered his mother, but ultimately his mother was like his last victim, I think. It was interesting that this pattern emerged, that in a lot of cases these serial killers, or at least 2 in this, but my guess is it's not reserved to just those 2. These serial killers ended up becoming the way they were because of terrible relationships with women during the formative years of their life. And those terrible relationships would not have come about if not for the dissatisfaction experienced by women and men, brought on in some small part by the gender revolution, right? The battle of the sexes, or the battle for equality that took place in the 1960s and 70s, and the fallout from that. And I mean, Milo Yiannopoulos has mentioned this before as well. Women are less happy today than they were 50 years ago. And every decade, the level of happiness and satisfaction that women report as having just lowers and lowers as time goes on. And the emotional divide between men and women now is greater than it ever was. Men too, I guess, are dissatisfied by and large, more and more as time goes on. And this is in part because he equates it anyway, and I'm sure others do as well, to the fact that traditional gender roles have sort of gone cast aside, right? In the quest for people finding their own individual happiness and thinking that, you know, they'll be fulfilled if they have a career, no matter who you are, what your gender is. Nobody's happy anymore. And I mean, I don't blame women for not being happy, because there's still those expectations of them being, you know, wives and mothers and homemakers, and, you know, listening to their biological clock and having kids before a certain age, and at the same time there's a desire and a push for them to seek out a career and fulfill yourselves in the world of work, and all these times they say go into STEM. Well, for the most part, a lot of women don't want to do STEM, but there's this idea that they must be encouraged at all costs to go into STEM so that the gender gap can be reduced. The gender gap is a response of choices that people make. And by and large, you still find that women are choosing to have kids and be mothers. But unfortunately, the economy is such that most women can't just do that full time. They gotta work, at least part time. That's what my mom did. But on those few occasions where my father was expected to be a caregiver in some sense, he had to cook us a meal at lunch, or cook us dinner. He was frustrated by the whole thing. I could tell he did not like doing it. And the few occasions where my father kind of lashed out was in instances where I showed disappointment in food I was being fed, or because that's not how mom does it, that kind of thing, right? And he's out of his element. He doesn't like it, and I'm complaining and whining because it's it's a change for me as well, and he's clearly frustrated by it. So I can get that. I understand that. It wasn't, I guess, the best idea for us as a society to say, okay, women, you got to work too, or you should work too. You should, not only should you work, but you should want to work, right? This idea that they've been sold this bill of goods. Yeah, you'll be much more fulfilled if you get a career just like your man. Just some observations and some things I thought about when I watched this Mindhunter series. And like I said, if you haven't seen it yet, you should definitely watch it. It's worth giving a glance. It's only 10 episodes long, and it's very interesting to see the transformation of the main character, the main protagonist, which is this guy named Holden Ford, who's sort of a rookie when the whole thing starts, but by the end of it, he becomes this sort of profiling savant, right? And when he starts, he's this, straight-laced, by the book, stuffed shirt, stiff. By the end of it, he's this, he's kind of this fucked up individual, and he comes to realize it by the end of the series. Again, give it a watch. You'll see what I mean. But just thinking about it in the context of society as a whole and changes in the sociological context and how that might have brought about an increase in serial killers, which again, up until near the end of this series, they hadn't even coined that phrase. They called them sequence killers, they called them organized killers, but it wasn't until near the end that they finally came up with the idea of calling them serial killers. Anyway, worth a boo. Watch it and think about it in the context of the time frame and see if I'm right. If you've seen it already and you think I'm full of shit, I don't know what I'm talking about, or you're expert in serial killers, and you think that I'm talking out my ass, go ahead and leave a comment. This is just an observation based on the two main cases or subjects that they studied in the series, in the first season of this series, and I hope it goes on. I think it will. Yeah, the first 10 episodes were pretty good. Season 2, I think, is only going to get better. But yeah, those are just my thoughts. Thanks. Talk to you later.